Hey guys, what's going on? So I think a lot of focus has been given towards the story of Anakin Skywalker, but not a whole lot of focus has really been given on his age throughout important events in his story. So I just wanted to go through a timeline of his life. So just a quick disclaimer, there are of course going to be several spoilers, and I am including a little bit of a mix of some canon and legends instances here, so it's not all technically canon, but I'm just building the timeline that I think would be most known for Anakin or Darth Vader. So the first thing we know is that at age 3, Anakin and his mom started getting enslaved by Watto, and that's where they really started to work in Watto's shop. That's where we see Anakin later in episode 1. So leading up to that, around age 8 is when he really starts building C-3PO, and the purpose was primarily for household chores and other duties to help out his mom. This is also where he starts pod racing. We have a few instances of him losing at this point, just really due to that extremely young age, in addition to a lot of the corruption going along in that time. And we even see some pretty indicating dreams of his passion to become a Jedi and really start to explore the galaxy. A year later, when he turns 9, that's when we see him in the Phantom Menace. That's where he first meets Padme, and that's where he races for his freedom, wins the pod race, is able to help Qui-Gon fix their ship, and that's really where Qui-Gon discovers Anakin and his Force sensitivity. That's where you get his midichlorian count. Qui-Gon really wanting to train Anakin, even though he is a lot later along in his childhood than most Padawans. And then just forwarding towards the end of the movie, we also get Anakin pretty much by accident ending up destroying the Trade Federation's main ship. So pretty symbolic to Luke later in the original movies. We of course have the death of Qui-Gon at the end of the movie and Obi-Wan Kenobi pledging that he would train Anakin. And then a year after that, we see him having a pretty hard time adjusting to his new life in Jedi training. We see several instances of him finding it extremely difficult to make any friends, but we also see a bunch of different missions that he tags along with Obi-Wan Kenobi. A year later, this is when we see Anakin build his first lightsaber, and then briefly following this, we also get a pretty high indication of Anakin's skill. We see him defeating a droid that would be mimicking Darth Maul from the Phantom Menace. This is really what catches the attention of Palpatine, and that's where, prior to kind of what we see in Revenge of the Sith, we do have a lot of these earlier meetings where Palpatine is able to start really trying to create a lasting impression on Anakin. They have a few meetings here, and we even see, just due to Palpatine's manipulation and a bunch of other things going on in Anakin's life, really still having trouble adjusting. We see Anakin briefly having motives of leaving the Jedi. He even does this momentarily, I believe, but then ultimately returns. We see a lot more missions over this 5-year period. This is really what leads closer to the events of Episode 2 or Attack of the Clones. We see, of course, in the newer Kenobi show, a flashback with some of their training. And then when the movie starts, Anakin is around 19 at this point. We see that he is now assigned to Padme to protect her, being a senator. We also have a pretty pivotal moment in his story where he finds his mother. She was pretty much dying at this point and died in his arms, luckily, but that's really where we see the first bit of rage from Anakin. We also see later in the movie losing to Count Dooku and losing his hand, and then in the end he gets married secretly to Padme. That's also where, of course, he builds a new lightsaber after it gets destroyed or lost. So going into age 20, we see some of this in the first editions of the Clone Wars with a much different style before it was really official. And that's where Anakin gets knighted. We see the ceremony there. We also see his duel with Asajj Ventress, and he's able to defeat her. And then we see him get Ahsoka as his new Padawan, so he's able to look after her and kind of show her the ropes. So this would of course be the first season of the Clone Wars, and that's where he also becomes a general. And this is also where the flashbacks with Ahsoka would be, and then leading into more events in the Clone Wars. Age 21 would be where Ahsoka leaves the Order. We have her being framed by Barriss Offee. Also another instance of him at 21 would be the Mortis plot points in season 5, where the prophecy is again confirmed by the father. And then following this, really the most pivotal point in Anakin's life, I'd say he's about just between 22 and 23, because we don't know the exact month when he was born. So somewhere in there, that's where we get in the beginning of Revenge of the Sith, we see him getting the best of Count Dooku this time, saving Palpatine. And this is where he also falls and becomes Darth Vader, falls to Palpatine's manipulation and really gives in. And he would also be around the same age that Luke is in Return of the Jedi. So I think that's just a interesting symbol there. And then was critically injured by Kenobi in their duel and was forced to wear a robotic suit for the rest of his life. So following his turn to the dark side and the events of Revenge of the Sith, we see him having to travel and fight Kirak Infala, another surviving Jedi after Order 66. And that's really where Anakin defeats him to build his lightsaber, so he bleeds Kirak's crystal and is able to defeat him without a lightsaber. So he really grows strong in the Force there and starts the Inquisitors, another group to help him find and eliminate Jedi. We see that first with Jocasta Nu and the Coruscant Library. And then about 6 months following this would be around the time period of the flashback in The Force Unleashed. That's really where we're introduced to Galen Merrick. So Vader would be about 23 or 24 at the time of finding him. This is also where he tracks down Farron Barr, another surviving Jedi. And then just following this, age 24, that's where we see Vader at the end of the Clone Wars in the season 7 finale. That's where he finds Ahsoka's lightsaber. And then we really don't get too much until the events of Jedi Fallen Order. Darth Vader would be 27 years old at that time, and that's where him, along with the Inquisitors, tracks down Cal Kestis and his master Junda. So that's where we get that first big fight between him and Cal. And also, just given some other lore, this is also around the time where he has his famous hunt game with Tarkin, just a little bit of a challenge there with their strategy. And then following this in his reign as Vader, 2 years later than this, when he turns 29, that's where he goes back to Mustafar and builds the fortress, just to really bring a full circle to where that tragic event happens. And that's where we see him later in instances such as Rogue One, and really where he would spend the majority of his time. It would be his main compound where he would soak in the Bacta tank 2 years after. We see a few rematches with Kenobi. The first one, he's not really trying, and then Kenobi gets the better of him the second time, and then the events of Jedi Survivor. So this is when he's again able to track down both Cal and Master Junda. We get this from Bode giving their coordinates after he betrayed him or was just some sort of a double agent. So that's where Cal is chasing Bode, and then Vader confronts Master Junda. The next major event, I would say, is when he turns 36. This would really be around the start of Rebels. This is also approximately where he learns that Ahsoka survived and is still alive. And then somewhere between this and age 38 would be in that finale where he fights Kanan briefly. And then following the later seasons, when he does turn 38 years old, that's approximately where he has his big fight with Ahsoka, his former apprentice. And then following of this would be the Force Unleashed storyline. So the first one there where he's really trained Galen, and now he's pretty much his secret apprentice, and he's sent on a few missions. And then just a year after this would also be the events of The Force Unleashed 2. That's where he clones Starkiller, and you get a continuation of their story, and Galen really turning to the good side that happens through the events of The Force Unleashed as well. And this is also the same time where we get the storyline of Vader Immortal, and then we're really leading into the original trilogy here. You have the events of Rogue One when he turns 41. This would be with the creation of the Death Star and the loopholes that are brought forth with that. And so that's where we get that big scene at the end where he goes on that rampage, really leading up to the beginning of A New Hope. And then we see the rebels holding on and getting those Death Star plans and giving them to Leia. And then, of course, in A New Hope, he would be 41 when we see that big fight scene with him and Kenobi, and Kenobi sacrifices himself in front of Luke, Han, and Leia. And then just following A New Hope, we also get some storylines of him traveling to Tatooine and getting a lot of connections with bounty hunters. That's where he would meet Boba Fett. So I'd say about a year after this, when he's 42, that's where he learns of Luke Skywalker's existence from Boba Fett. And then this would lead into The Empire Strikes Back. We get his first duel with Luke, and then that famous scene where he reveals his true identity to his son. And then also during this time, that's where we get the storyline of him traveling back to Naboo for the first time after becoming Vader, and that's where we get him visiting Padme's grave. Return of the Jedi would be just a year after, so he would be 45 in that. And that's where we see his rematch with Luke. Luke gets the better of him and then is struck by Force lightning from Palpatine, and that's where Vader really fulfills his prophecy of bringing balance to the Force and sacrifices himself for his son, even though I would say he is also redeemed by his son and is returned to the light side of the Force. So we see that just before he dies in those famous lines where he tells Luke that he was right about him. So that's really the end of Anakin's story. And I think you have a lot of pretty powerful scenes in the original trilogy. And I'd say just some comments on Anakin's character overall. I think you really do have a full circle, really interesting with the prophecy of bringing balance to the Force. I wouldn't say that's just from defeating Palpatine within itself. I think it also really speaks to the creation of his kids with Luke and Leia, even though he didn't have that much of a hand in raising them. And I think in terms of Anakin's character portrayal over the movies, I think his arc is really done fairly well. The only criticisms I would give, I'd much rather him not have been involved in Order 66 or a lot of the more horrific allusions to what he did during that time. Even though we know he did a lot of evil things as Vader, I would have liked to see him be sidelined in that role. And you can still have Order 66 happen with the clones, but you just have Vader being pretty much a force for the Empire, not engaging in what he did with his march to the Jedi Temple and what follows that. So I think that was just really taken out of proportion there and went a little bit too far. But I still find it somewhat hard to believe he would have turned to the dark side given his training under Obi-Wan Kenobi. But you do have the Jedi being kind of disconnected and not really being extremely understanding and a little bit too stiff in their ways and their rules. And then given his return to the light, you have, of course, Hayden Christensen now being seen in the post-edited version of his Force Ghost at the end. I would still think this makes sense. We see Anakin around the age where we last saw him as a Jedi, just before turning to the dark side. So I think that would make sense when you look at it from that angle. And I think in terms of any more future projects you could do with Vader or Anakin, you already have a lot of the story being revolved around him. You could even make the argument of all 6 movies being centered on him. So I don't think you really need to do anything, but I still think you do have a lot of opportunities to fill in different gaps in Vader's life that we haven't seen yet, whether it was a live action show, part of a movie, a solo movie, some sort of another animated project that was really focused on Vader. I think you could get him right after his turn to the dark side, and then you see the Kirok mission and a lot of the other journeys he takes. You even could do him later in his life between any of the movies, even such as the original trilogy, for instance, before Empire Strikes Back and after A New Hope. You have him learning of Luke from Boba Fett. You have his return to Naboo and visiting Padme's grave, or really just seeing a different side of Vader that we haven't really gotten yet. In terms of, we know that Vader is his new soul identity, but I think we see in several instances of the books and the comics that Vader is really just this facade. It's like this robotic new personality for Anakin to really rage out on a lot of his trauma, but I wouldn't say that is his true self. I think we see that in instances of him being out of the suit, when he's healing, when he's coming out of the Bacta tank, or just taking off his helmet. We really see how sad Anakin has become, if there is any bit of him left. I would say that's the real version of Anakin at this time, and Vader is really just a mask that he hides behind. But we really see such a tragic version of Anakin, such a suffering version of Anakin. It's really like he's living through hell at this point in time, and really whatever instances of evil that he does, it really isn't enough to fulfill him in the end. And I think that could really be a focus to any sort of new Vader project in the future. But then again, I don't think we necessarily need any, but you definitely have a lot of substance there. So really an interesting character, probably one of the best villains of all time, and you really have that through years of character arcs and development. So feel free to let me know your thoughts on Darth Vader's character, any of these points along with his timeline, or any thoughts you have on that. Really appreciate you guys watching, and I'll see you later.